Imagine a place where the sky feels so close you could almost touch it. A place where silence is sacred, and nature itself seems to hold its breath. Jesus, accompanied by Peter, James, and John, climbs a mountain. A seemingly ordinary mountain, yet about to become the stage for a supernatural event. What they didn't know was that they were about to witness something that would forever change how they saw the Master. Suddenly, the sky opened, and the reality around them began to transform. Jesus, the man they followed and called Master, began to shine with a light that wasn't of this world. His appearance changed, and his clothes became as white as no human dye could ever produce. It was as if heaven itself had touched the earth at that very moment. But what came next was even more astonishing. Two men appeared beside Jesus, imposing figures wrapped in heavenly glory. Moses and Elijah, the giants of faith, standing there before the bewildered eyes of the disciples. What was happening on that mountain? Why were these two men, who lived in such distant times, now standing side by side with Jesus? The answer lay hidden in that sublime moment, a mystery about to be revealed. The disciples' eyes were fixed on Moses and Elijah, figures they had only known through the sacred scriptures. Now there they were, as real as the mountain they stood on. Moses, the great deliverer of Israel, the one who received the law directly from God on Mount Sinai. And Elijah, the bold prophet, who challenged kings and idolaters with fire from heaven. The two of them were talking with Jesus, not in solemn or distant tones, but like old friends meeting after a long journey. There was a familiarity in the way they spoke to him, as if they had been together in another time, in another place. Peter, impulsive as always, couldn't contain himself. He wanted to act, to do something to mark the moment. "Lord," he said, "it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But little did he know that the true significance of that encounter went far beyond any physical structure he could build. Peter's words still lingered in the air when a dense and radiant cloud began to envelop them. It wasn't an ordinary cloud. There was a presence in it, an almost palpable force. The disciples' hearts raced, and the silence was broken by a voice that didn't come from any of the 3 men before them, but from the very center of that glowing cloud. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." It was the voice of God, clear and powerful, resonating in each of their hearts. In that instant, all attention turned to Jesus. Moses and Elijah had fulfilled their roles. They represented the law and the prophets, but now Jesus stood at the center of it all. He was the fulfillment of everything Moses and Elijah represented. And the voice of the Heavenly Father affirmed this in an undeniable way. The disciples, overcome with fear, fell face down on the ground, unable to bear the weight of that glory. The reality of who Jesus truly was not just the Master, but the Son of God, the Anointed One, was unveiled before their eyes, and what followed would change the course of history forever. Gradually, the fear began to fade. The sound of that powerful voice still echoed in their hearts, but the environment around them started to shift again. Peter, James, and John, with their faces still pressed against the ground, felt a gentle hand touch them. It was Jesus. He bent down, and with the tenderness that only he possessed, said, "Get up, don't be afraid." When they looked up, the cloud was gone. Moses and Elijah were no longer there. Only Jesus remained, with the same warm and serene gaze as always, as if that heavenly encounter was just another ordinary day. But for them, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The glory they had witnessed forever changed how they saw Jesus. They remained silent, perhaps still processing everything they had seen. The Transfiguration revealed the true nature of the Master, a glory that had been hidden until then. In that brief moment on the mountain, Jesus showed them not only his power but also the deep connection between the past and the future, between the law, the prophets, and the gospel. Jesus began to descend the mountain, and they followed him, their hearts filled with reverence. They knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, but the words to express it still eluded them. As they descended the mountain in silence, the disciples couldn't stop thinking about Moses' appearance. the great liberator of Israel, the man who confronted Pharaoh and led the people through the wilderness, had been standing there before them. But why Moses? Why, among all the figures in sacred history, was he chosen to appear beside Jesus in such a glorious moment? Moses represented something far greater than his own story. He was the symbol of the law, the one God had given to guide the people on the path of righteousness. Moses' presence on that mountain revealed that Jesus wasn't there to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Moses had received the law inscribed on tablets of stone, but now Jesus, the living Word, was bringing the true essence of the law, written on the hearts of men. And there was more. Moses had not entered the promised land during his lifetime, but now, on that mountain, he was in the presence of the one who was the true promise, the true deliverer. The cycle was complete. What Moses had begun, Jesus was about to finish. As the disciples reflected on Moses, their thoughts turned to Elijah, the fearless prophet, the man who challenged false gods and remained faithful to God in times of great apostasy. But why Elijah? Why did he appear alongside Jesus at that moment? Elijah symbolized the prophets, those who had spoken in the name of God, often in the face of danger and persecution. He represented the prophetic voice that called the people back to the covenant with the Lord. But Elijah was also known as the forerunner of the Messiah, the one who, according to prophecy, would come before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. His presence beside Jesus confirmed that all the prophecies were coming true. Elijah, who had been taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, was now standing there, witnessing the beginning of God's redemptive work in Christ. What he had announced, what so many prophets had waited for, was about to happen. The disciples began to understand that this encounter was not just a glorious vision. It was a bridge between the promise and its fulfillment, between the law and the prophets, and now everything converged in Jesus. As they descended the mountain, the magnitude of what they had witnessed began to sink deeper into their minds and hearts. Moses and Elijah weren't there by chance. The encounter held spiritual significance that transcended time and space. Jesus, the Son of God, was about to carry out the most significant act in history, the redemption of humanity. And on that mountain, heaven opened to reveal the connection between the old and the new, between what was and what was to come. The presence of Moses and Elijah indicated that Jesus wasn't walking alone. He was the fulfillment of all of Israel's history, the culmination of centuries of divine revelation. Moses and Elijah, representing the law and the prophets, were there to witness that everything they had lived and prophesied was pointing to this moment. It was as if heaven was signing an agreement, a sacred covenant, confirming that Jesus was the chosen one, the promised Messiah. And for the disciples, that encounter meant more than they could comprehend in that moment. They were seeing with their own eyes that Jesus wasn't just a teacher or a prophet, but the very Son of God, in whom all sacred history found its purpose and fulfillment. What had begun as an ordinary journey up the mountain had transformed into a divine revelation, a glimpse of eternal glory, and the redemptive purpose that was about to be fulfilled. When they finally reached the foot of the mountain, the disciples were still immersed in the magnitude of what they had witnessed. It was hard to return to the routine of daily life after seeing the Master's glory in his divine form. Yet, life would soon call them back to reality, and the world around them, unaware of what had happened atop that mountain, remained the same. But for Peter, James, and John, nothing would ever be the same. That experience had forever changed how they saw Jesus. They could no longer ignore the depth of his mission and what it meant for the future. Still, there were questions they didn't dare ask, details their hearts struggled to comprehend. Jesus had instructed them not to tell anyone what they had seen, not until he had risen from the dead. What did that mean? The idea of resurrection was still a mystery to them, something that sounded distant, almost incomprehensible. But Jesus' command was clear. They were to keep what they had witnessed to themselves until the time was right. And so, they carried that secret in their hearts, knowing that what they had seen on the mountain was a preparation for something much greater. Jesus had given them a glimpse of his true identity and the destiny that awaited them. As they descended, the silence between them was filled with reverence and awe. The words still echoed in their minds. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." The voice of God himself had spoken to them, making it clear that above all else, they were to follow Jesus, listen to his words, and grasp what he was about to accomplish. What they had witnessed on the mountain was not just a celestial manifestation. It was a direct confirmation that Jesus was more than the teacher they knew, more than the Messiah they had expected. He was God's beloved Son, chosen to fulfill the most important mission in the universe. The voice that spoke from the cloud was not just a reminder to listen to Jesus, but a revelation that his authority was supreme, above everything they had known until that moment. The disciples now knew that Jesus was not just a great leader or a prophet, but the very Son of God, with whom the Father was fully pleased. This knowledge filled them with a mix of fear, love, and responsibility. They had witnessed something that very few could ever imagine, and now every word of Jesus carried even greater weight. The divine voice had spoken, and their lives would never be the same. As they left the mountain behind and returned to the reality of daily life, the disciples carried with them not just the memory of what they had seen, but also the weight of what it all meant. The encounter with Moses and Elijah, the transfiguration of Jesus, and God's voice speaking directly to them were more than moments of awe. They were milestones of a new understanding, a call to something greater. They had seen the past and the future meet in Jesus. Moses represented the law, Elijah the prophets, and both pointed to the Messiah standing before them. Jesus' mission was not just to continue the work of Moses or Elijah, but to bring the story to its glorious conclusion. And now, the disciples understood that they themselves were part of this story. Jesus' words about keeping silent until his resurrection weighed heavily on their minds. What was the resurrection? How could they comprehend the magnitude of what was to come? But even without all the answers, they knew they needed to trust Jesus, follow him, and be ready for what lay ahead. The Transfiguration was not just a vision, but a revelation that Jesus was the center of everything: the law, the prophets, and God's plan of salvation. And the disciples, though still fearful, now walked with a new conviction. They had been chosen to witness, to learn, and, at the right time, to share the truth that would transform the world. The road ahead would be full of challenges, but with every step, the memory of that moment on the mountain would guide them, reminding them that they were following the Son of God, in whom the Father was well pleased. And above all, this gave them the strength and faith to continue, knowing that the story they had lived was just the beginning of something far greater.